Hello and welcome to part 2 of how to build a deck with a budget mana base. Last time we looked at the deck itself, this time we're going to be looking at the lands. So if you haven't checked out the last video, link will be down in the description below, so check out that video first before you jump into this one. Okay, so let's start with some good budget land options. Hopefully this video won't age horribly and all these shoot up in price, so I'm mainly going to be talking about lands that have at least been reprinted or have been out for a while and aren't super pricey. Firstly, we're going to be looking at cards that tap for all of the colours of our deck. The best of these is obviously Command Tower, which should probably be an auto-include in any deck that's more than one colour. After that, we have Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. These do bring the lands into play tapped, but they get any colour that we need and are fantastic at what they do. The next one is primarily for 3+ colour decks, but in those, Exotic Orchard is a great budget include. In most 4-player games, this should easily tap for at least 2 colours of your deck, if not all of them. And what's better is that it comes into play untapped and it's still nice and cheap. Next on this list is Path of Ancestry. Again, while it comes in tapped, it always gets all of our colours, and then even if you're on a non-tribal deck, getting the occasional scry is a nice bonus. Moving on to dual-coloured lands now, one of the issues with this section is that some cycles aren't complete yet, so hopefully we'll see them in future sets, which will gain complete cycles for us budget mana players. In terms of budget duals, I don't think you can go wrong with the Pain lands. In a 40 life format, the few times you have to pay the life for them won't matter, and the fact they come into play untapped is obviously great. Next up is the Odyssey block filter lands. These have been reprinted enough that they're nice and cheap, and while they don't do much on turn 1, you're often not keeping many one-landers, and again they don't come into play tapped, so they give you access to your mana straight away. If you have any cards in your deck that tutor up non-basic lands, then I really think it's a good idea to look at cards with multiple land types on them. We're not talking about original Jewels or Shocks, we're looking at the Battle lands, the Cycling lands, and even the Snow Jewels from Kaldheim. While a lot of these come into play tapped, being able to tutor them up with things like Farseek make them a great include. Moving up a bit in price, I'm a big fan of the Check lands. Again, these work really well with the lands with multiple land types that we mentioned just before, and give you a really good chance of not having them come into play tapped. These have gradually gone up since their last reprint in Standard, but they do show up every now and then in Commander products, which shows that they're happy to reprint them every so often. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the really budget lands, like the Gates, the Gain lands, and the Snow Jewels. These might seem like an auto-include in budget builds, but you really don't want to run too many of them. The reason for this is that they really slow down your deck, and can leave you a turn or two behind everyone else at the table. They are very budget, and they can have a place, but you shouldn't just jam them all into your deck. The only really budget lands that I'm actually happy running are the bounce lands, as these have additional value when you can do things like untapping your land, or even as a discard outlet on turn 2. I've broken down on screen how many lands that enter the battlefield tapped I would personally want to run. This goes up as we're playing more colours, as doing this on a budget it gets harder and harder. But generally speaking, this is an upper number. In an ideal world, practically none of our lands would enter tapped. When counting up the number of tapped lands you should play, you also need to consider your utility lands, which we'll cover in a moment. This section is meant as a bit of a cheat step. In the real world, most people won't have perfect cycles of each land type they want to run. We're going to have a bit of a hodgepodge of different jewels, and this is even more so when we're working on a budget. So with that in mind, on screen here we've put how many jewel lands of each type to run in a deck. This goes down the more colours you play, as you need to make room for the different types of jewel lands. As in a 2-colour deck, you're only running 1 type of jewel land, but in a 3-colour deck, you're running 3 types of jewel lands, and when you go to 5 colours, it can go up to 10 different types of jewel lands. If all your colours are equal, then you can split the jewel lands up evenly. If you're leaning more towards one colour, then focus on the jewels that tap for one of those colours. You'll know this from the pip breakdown that we did in the previous video. But as a quick refresher, the pip breakdown is the number of different pips in all of your spells' converted mana costs. Personally, I don't think people play enough utility lands. What I classify these as are lands that tap for mana, but then give us an additional effect. These can really help decks out. They can either give effects that the deck already has, which is nice because it adds redundancy. So a Voltron deck that wants to get damage through can run a Rogue's Passage like this, for example. Or they can add an effect to a deck that is missing. So a deck without any graveyard interaction can run something like Scavenger Grounds. Or a deck that's lacking on card draw can run some of the Cycling lands to help smooth it out. Generally speaking, in a Commander deck, I'd want to run 8 utility lands. I've put on screen here the split between ones that do tap for a colour of mana and ones that don't tap for a colour of mana. Basically, as the more colours your deck is, the less room you have for lands that don't help fix you. But conversely, you can run a lot more in a monocoloured deck. It's actually a really good bonus for these decks. Some utility lands come into play tapped and some don't, so do keep that in mind as they will count towards how many tap lands you should be playing. The last step is filling up the remaining slots in your land base with basic lands. Generally, you want between 36 and 38 lands in total, so what we're going to do is minus the lands we already have. So we're going to minus our lands that get all of our colours, we're going to minus our jewels, and we're going to minus our utility lands, and the number we're left with will be the number of basics that we're going to be running. Again, going back to our rough pip breakdown, split your basic lands to match this. So for example, if your deck is 50% green, 50% of your basics should be forest. You don't have to be super exact here, I've never actually found it to be much of an issue. But if you'd like to, sites like Tapped Out will give you the split of your mana requirements exactly, and the split of your mana sources, so you can line them up perfectly. One last little section to touch on before we finish up is that recently there's been a lot of very popular commanders that have been printed that really lead themselves to budget decks. Cards like Gigantha, Golos, Ramos, and Asika in different ways all allow you to run a multicolored deck with a budget mana base, by themselves being able to tap or generate multicolored mana. One of the reasons why they're so popular is that they give 5 colors to everyone, regardless of your budget. If you're planning on building a 5-color deck on a budget, I would 100% recommend using one of these as a starting point. Okay, thank you very much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that there were some helpful things in there. That was basically my process, how I build decks myself, trying to condense it down into 2 videos that made some sense. Please let me know what you think. Please let me know if you have any tips and tricks. Maybe there'll be a part 3 where we kind of go back through some of the feedback we've got. That could be quite cool. But until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.